This is Fort Mellon Park. It was the site of a Second Seminole War fort and battle. So let's check this out. This is the site of Fort Mellon Monument. This interpretive display describes the founding of Fort Mellon and the early history of the site. Originally called Camp Monroe, the fort was established on the west shore of Lake Monroe by the U.S. Army during the Second Seminole War in December 1836. Camp Mellon was located at a strategic point on Lake Monroe, which flowed north into the St. Johns River, a major artery of communication and transportation, and garrisoned by 300 troops. Camp Monroe played a major role as a staging point for transporting troops and supplies for campaigns further south. Camp Monroe was enclosed on 3 sides, but open to Lake Monroe. A long pier was built for receiving supplies in 1837. Fort Mellon Park was the site of the Battle of Camp Monroe, which was fought on February 8, 1837, during the Second Seminole War. Before daybreak, a large body of 400 Seminole warriors, led by Amathla, also known as King Philip, and his son Coacoochee, known as Wildcat, launched a surprise attack on Camp Monroe while the soldiers were asleep in their tents. The soldiers, who slept with their rifles, were immediately roused to defend the fort. Several fortuitous instances contributed to the U.S. Army's victory. Many of the soldiers had disobeyed their commander's orders to replace their flints with wooden chips for training purposes planned that morning. The day before the battle, the soldiers had constructed a large pine log wall around the camp, which prevented the Seminoles' direct access. Of interesting note, Captain W. Gordon of the Dragoons happened to be armed with an experimental repeating rifle, known as Cochrane's many-chambered gun, which Gordon reported about enthusiastically after the battle. Lieutenant Alexander Fanning fired on the attacking Seminoles with a 6-pound cannon from a steamboat along the lakeside at a pivotal moment during the battle. After a fierce firefight, the Seminoles were driven away, retreating westward to the Ocklawaha River. The U.S. suffered 1 killed and 14 wounded. Captain Charles Mellon was the only U.S. fatality. 3 days later, Camp Monroe was renamed Fort Mellon. The next month, in March 1837, a capitulation agreement was established between the U.S. Army and the Seminoles. By May 1837, 2,500 Seminoles, including Osceola, peacefully camped near the fort under the terms of the agreement. But the peace did not last long. On June 15, 1837, Fort Mellon was temporarily closed due to sickness, but was reoccupied by the U.S. military on November 4, 1837. Fort Mellon suffered another outbreak of sickness in June 1840, and its functions were temporarily transferred to Fort Reed, a new fort constructed 1.5 miles south, until January 1841. Several prominent officers served at or traveled through Fort Mellon during the Second Seminole War, including Brigadier General Thomas Jessup, Brigadier General Joseph Hernandez, Colonel William S. Harney, Colonel David E. Twiggs, all of whom were eventually became leading generals in the U.S. Army. If you enjoyed this time visiting Fort Mellon Park in Sanford, Florida, and discussing the Battle of Camp Monroe, please click like, subscribe to our channel, and we will see you on our next adventure.